So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first Angevin Talk of 2022. Tonight, introducing our guest of honor is truly a great privilege. Among his enormous achievements, our honorable guest is a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2007 to 2010, where he is widely credited, amongst other things, with averting the Second Great Depression. Prior to this, he was the longest serving Chancellor of the Exchequer in modern British history, spending over a decade in the Treasury. Our guest serves as the UN Special Envoy for Global Education, is the author of several books, a passionate advocate for social justice, tirelessly tackling global issues, and advocating for public policy to address the most pressing problems we face today. Please join me with our hosts, Queen's MCR, in extending a warm welcome to the Right Honourable Gordon Brown.
A pleasure.
Gordon, welcome. We are truly honoured with your presence here this evening. Our audience tonight extends widely from Cambridge, Queen's College Fellows and members of SCR, from many College Cambridges, faculties of economics and political science, Judge Business School, friends and colleagues from all over the UK, Europe, America, South Africa, and Canada. This morning in the Financial Times, you wrote an op-ed ahead of the G20 finance ministers meeting that COVID burden sharing must remain high up on the agenda. And to quote you, must not be downgraded out of misguided complacency. You've been a vocal advocate for vaccine equity and working tirelessly with the WHO as your partner. The amount of money required to get this right is tremendous. How would you like to see this work?
Well, let me first of all say, Anna, what a real pleasure it is to be interviewed by you. I know you've got a famous former graduate of the college, Emily Maitlis, at Newsnight, and obviously this is the tradition of the college to have great interviewers.
Well,
I'm also pleased to be alongside Anna El-Erian, who I turn to for advice and who has never got it wrong on the economy, I can tell you, and that's why so many people respect him so much, and I think you'll be very happy to have him as president of the college. And I'm also very happy to be with students and staff. And I think out of the students this evening, there will be a future Prime Minister, or there will be a future Chancellor, or there will be a future leader of one of the other countries that is well represented this evening at this event. And so I do want to address my remarks also to future leaders, as well as to the community as a whole. Yet today, look, if we're going to solve the health problems we face, and that's not just vaccination, it's testing, and of course it's preventing future pandemics. If we're going to solve the climate change problems we face and the global education problems we face, all are global problems that require global solutions, we've got to have a way of sharing the burden. And so when we finance UN peacekeeping, we do it by each country allocated according to their capacity to pay. When we look at other issues related to the IMF and the World Bank, every country has a quota. But control of infectious diseases is the most significant and perhaps the most obvious public good of all. And yet we don't have a proper burden sharing agreement. And the result is we're looking for 16.8 billion this year so that we could finance vaccination testing in the poorest countries. And remember, only 5% are vaccinated in low-income countries, only 11% in Africa. Only 1 in 100 vaccines are in the low-income countries. Only 1 in 200 of the tests are being done there. So we really need a burden-sharing agreement where the richest countries pay the contribution they can, and some of the other countries pay a minimal contribution, but are part of the same effort. And I really don't think we can get the world moving fast enough on these huge challenges, global problems that need global solutions, like climate change, and like, of course, pandemics and global public health, unless we come to an agreement that just as after 1945, we agreed on burden sharing for UN peacekeeping, we should agree on burden sharing for climate change and global health. And I hope that I could persuade you this evening that this is the most sensible way forward, because the alternative is like what is going to happen in the next few weeks. You pass a begging bowl round, and it's like a whip round at a charity fundraiser instead of a serious attempt to deal with one of the biggest problems that we have to overcome. Now, 12 billion vaccines have now been produced, enough to vaccinate every adult in the world twice over. But the distribution of these vaccines is so skewed that we've got to do something about it as a global community.
Well, I was looking at the data ahead of our talk, and as of yesterday, we had 413 million people infected worldwide and 5.83 million deaths.
Yes.
And so
we're paying a very heavy price for not cooperating. You see, what happened was vaccine nationalism. So countries bought up the supplies, and a few countries monopolized them, even to the extent of hoarding them, so that many have actually had to be destroyed because they've passed their use-by date. And then what happened to Africa was three things, really. One, they didn't get the vaccines because they had not got access to the original supply, mainly European and American pharmaceutical companies. Then we didn't give them the right to get patents and transfer them to these countries so they could produce their own vaccines. And then almost tragically, European Union officials insisted on airlifting vaccines out of Africa when Europe had been 60% vaccinated at that time, and Africa really only 2 or 3%. We were actually sending vaccines from Africa, manufactured in Africa, without the patent, of course, but manufactured and assembled in Africa, and we were sending them to Europe. So it was a form of colonialism, I'm afraid, that really cannot be justified. So we've got to do better. And as you know, we cannot solve this problem unless we solve it in every continent. And nobody really is safe until everybody's safe, because the disease will continue to spread and mutate. And the World Health Organization has just produced a report showing the countries most likely to have immunocompromised people and less vaccination than anybody else are where the disease is going to mutate. And that's Yemen, that's Burundi, that's possibly Nigeria, actually, the DRC, all these countries where only about 2% have been vaccinated. So it's actually in our interest, it's in our enlightened self-interest to vaccinate the world.
And I was going to say, it's really not only for moral reasons, but for our own self-interest, because ultimately that's how we all get better and hopefully continue.
Do you know who taught me that message? Nelson Mandela. I was very fortunate that after he came out of prison, I met him on numerous occasions, particularly in the years before he died. And Nelson Mandela told me about what happened the night that he became free, the night that he was released from prison. He called together all the members of the African National Congress, and he said to them, look, we would be justified in taking revenge because of what had happened under apartheid, but there would be a bloodbath. Everybody would lose. The whole country would be in flames. We'd never be able to create a peaceful society. And he pleaded with them and said, do not go out there looking for retaliation. Go out there looking to build bridges. And it's in our self-interest as the African National Congress to get the whole of Africa and the whole of South Africa in particular working together. And that was how he explained enlightened self-interest. I had a great time with Mandela because he came to London, and I should tell you this story if you allow me. And we were raising money after he was president for the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And so Nelson Mandela had written a letter to a child, and you can actually see it on the internet. His advice to a child starting out in life, the importance of education and everything else. And he was optioning the original version of what he'd written in his own handwriting to raise money for his foundation. And everybody was there that night. Will Smith from Hollywood, Emma Thompson, I remember, Bill Clinton was there, Hillary Clinton. We had Elton John was there. I'm just remembering all the people that were there, Oprah Winfrey. And so they bid for this letter. And the prices that were coming in as bids were just amazing. 200, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000, 600, and it got to 800,000. And there was only two people left, Elton John and Oprah Winfrey. And they were bidding against each other, sitting at the same table as me and putting up their hands. So Oprah goes to 900,000. Elton goes to 1 million. Oprah then goes to 1.1 million. Elton pulls out. And then Oprah's told she's paying in pounds and not dollars. She had thought she was bidding in dollars. But Mandela had this great capacity to bring people together. And it wasn't just out of morality. It was out of showing people that, as was said after 1945, our national interest lies in international cooperation. The interest of a particular group in our society lies in cooperating as an entire society. And I think this lesson we've failed really to transmit this lesson during this crisis, because if countries close down and they refuse to help other countries, it's actually self-defeating, as we know.
Gordon, I'd like to turn to your early life. You were born and lived in Kirkcaldy, an industrial town in Fife. I hope I'm saying it correctly.
You are indeed. You are indeed. And not many people get that right.
Thank you. Which was the birthplace of Adam Smith.
Exactly.
And Dunfermline was the town next door, which was the birthplace of Andrew Carnegie.
That's right.
So this was the influence and the place you grew up with. Your late dad, John Ebenezer Brown, was a Presbyterian minister.
Yeah.
Can we touch on how your early life has influenced and contributed to who you are and your passion for social justice?
Well, I think it's so much of all of us. You know, when we're growing up, we don't quite realize the influences upon us until we look back and say, well, that's what made me want to do this. I was very influenced by Andrew Carnegie because of his philanthropy. Dunfermline had the money. Kirkcaldy had the intellect because they had Adam Smith and his reputation. And although many people in Kirkcaldy had never heard of Adam Smith, I mean, we now have an Adam Smith festival. There's now an Adam Smith lecture. There's an Adam Smith foundation, which is a global foundation. So there's a huge amount built around Adam Smith. And I wanted to be an academic. You know, learning from Adam Smith and others, I wanted to be a lecturer. I didn't want to be a politician. I started off wanting to be like the masters and the staff of Queen's College. I wanted to be an academic. And
did your PhD, so that's
I did a PhD, but you know, I started off thinking, well, I want to be an academic. And universities, I said, they stand for rationality, objectivity, impartiality, the pursuit of knowledge, the search for truth. And I knew these were all the qualities you had to leave behind when you go into politics. It's so bad. My first lecture actually was in the university extension courses. And that's what brought me down to earth, actually, because people from the community signed up for the extension courses, like in Kirkcaldy and Edinburgh. And my course was on modern studies, and 6 people signed up to that. And then there was a gardening course, which was put on, 200 people signed up. And then when I came to my first lecture, there was only 2 people turned up, not 6, only 2 turned up. And one of them was to be the chairman. And he said, look, I've got another meeting I'd rather go to. So he left, and I only had 1 person at my first lecture. So it was a bit of a disappointment. But I had started off, when I couldn't be a footballer or anything like that, I wanted to be a university academic. And I learned that really from the libraries and you know, my father, of course, being a minister, was well educated. And one of the things that I learned from him was he spoke without notes for much of his ministry. And so he would do a sermon that would be 20 or 30 minutes. It wasn't an hour, and he'd speak without notes. And I learned the benefit of speaking without notes then. I always wanted to do that. And when I was lecturing at Edinburgh University, we had huge classes, 500 sometimes, 300, 400. And it was far better to speak without notes than to speak with notes. But it's a discipline you've got to learn.
Well, we're going to go to the football in a minute, but you were a child prodigy starting high school at 10. University at 16, you were the youngest student there since 1945.
Yeah.
In your memoir, My Life, Our Times, you mention your great love of sport. You initially aspired to be a footballer.
Yeah.
But then a football manager. Local club, the Wraith Rovers. Do you still love them, or are you still?
Well, they've been in trouble recently, but I still want to help them. And then I would like to have been a football owner if I couldn't be the manager, but I never had the money to do so. So actually, I was planning to be an academic, and then I got all these eye injuries playing sport. Right. So I detached my retina, lost the sight in my left eye after 3 big operations, where you had to lie, in these days, you had to lie blinded for weeks. And then I had a 4th operation, which was successful and saved the sight of my right eye. But it was during that time, 1, I realized I would never be able to do sport again in the way that I had. And 2, lying flat, blinded for 10 days at a time, it made you think about what you wanted to do. And that's, I suppose, when I made the decision that, yeah, it'd be great to be a lecturer. And I did do that for a few years, but there was something I could do, because I'd grown up in a town that had been a mining town and linoleum, a textile town. And I'd seen the unemployment and the poverty rising as these jobs left. And I thought, this is not only immoral, it's irrational. We must do something about it. And that's really what lying flat for days and thinking about these things, that's when I decided I would want to do something more political than academic.
Well, the accident happened when it was a rugby match and you were kicked in the head. You were the youngest in the team. Yeah,
I mean, we were playing the former pupils actually, and it was a pretty rough game, but it was in the first few minutes, and I got kicked, yes, and I gradually lost the sight in my left eye, and the science, and this is why listening to medical students this evening is really good as well, because the science was not advanced then. And my sight was actually saved by a young surgeon who was born in, whose father had come from India and who had trained in Chicago, actually. And I think, the first operation he did with these new techniques. And so I was very lucky. At 21, I thought I was losing my sight altogether. And so I was very lucky to be able to save it. And I've been grateful to him, and I keep in touch with him and meet him ever since, because these were the new techniques that hadn't been used before when I had the problem in my left eye. So I was very lucky, and I always feel very fortunate that I was able to survive that and move on. And it did make me think about what contribution I could make. And I know that maybe sounds a bit preachy, but it was thinking what could you actually do to make a difference.
Well, in 1999, one of your great achievements in public life was to persuade America and Europe to join the UK in debt relief, to forgive, 200 billion in national debt in Africa and Asia.
That's
and
right.
Your first day as Chancellor of the Exchequer, you gave the Bank of England its independence, the first thing you did.
That's right. We didn't tell people beforehand, because they would have said that interest rates were bound to go up and we'd be responsible for that. But we made the Bank of England independent. Interest rates did go up. And we started to sort what was the stop-go cycle. I mean, anybody studying economics will know that in Britain, really from the 60s, it used to be said of Britain, in the 60s, we managed decline. In the 70s, we mismanaged decline. And in the 80s, we declined to manage. And we had this inflation problem that was basically the boom-bust economy. And we felt that if we could create the stability and the long-term perspective, that an independent bank, free of political influence, could make these decisions on interest rates, which had actually been postponed because of the general election, that you would have an apolitical way of making long-term decisions. And it did work, I think, because Britain became far more stable economically. The inflation problem didn't lead to, was reduced around the world, but in Britain as well. And we didn't have a price-wage spiral, which we might have expected, as it happened in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s before we made the bank independent. So I do attribute a lot of Britain's gains in cutting inflation and stopping the stop-go economy to that decision.
Where does the courage of your convictions come from? That assurance in yourself that this is the right decision to make?
I don't know that you can always be sure that you are making the right decision. I think you've got to go on your instinct about what is right and on careful preparation and planning. Now, when we made the Bank of England independent, we spent probably 2 years beforehand, thinking out all the different options and how we might do it. So we did not give the Bank of England goal independence. The government still set the inflation target. We gave them operational independence, and I think that has actually worked. We set up a monetary policy committee, which is a bit different from the European Central Bank and a bit different from the Federal Reserve. So we looked at very carefully. It's a lot of planning has to go into it, but I don't think you can ever say that you know that what you're doing is always going to be right. I think you've got to have, I wouldn't like to be attributed to, you know, that book that someone wrote, Modesty and How I Achieved It. That's not me. I actually feel that we can make mistakes, but we can learn from them at the same time. You know, Keynes actually said politics was the survival of the unfittest rather than the survival of the best. And he may have had a point.
But it's the courage to act and not be scared to act, right? There's fear, but it does take courage to act.
Yeah, I wrote a book of essays when my daughter died, and we set up the Jennifer Brown research laboratory to look at prematurity. And for example, we've looked at why so many people lose their sight in the first minutes and hours of their life because of the wrong supply of oxygen if they're premature. Stevie Wonder, for example, the pop singer, was not born blind. He became blind in the first few minutes because he was given too much oxygen, not too little, but too much oxygen. And so some of these problems that we saw because of what had happened to my daughter when she was born. So we set up this foundation because we thought we could make something of a difference to medical research in that area. So everything that happens in your life is you know, there's grief, but there's also learning as a result of that. And I like to think that's made something of a difference to the way we deal with prematurity. Yes,
and you know, and the ability to recover from a monumental tragedy like that.
You asked about courage, because I was just going to say, and I should have said then, when she died, to raise funds for this foundation, I edited a book of essays of my own that I wrote about courage, about people who had shown courage and the people I admired for showing courage. And there were two things that always came clear to me: that people of courage, and I go from Martin Luther King to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but also to sort of famous people in the past, is one, people have a clear idea of what they want to achieve, but you've got to have the willpower to be able to see it through. And that was the lesson I learned when I was writing this book and writing about the individual portraits of people. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, the people who risked their lives to help other people's lives be saved. They not only had a clear idea of what was right and wrong, but they also had willpower. They just didn't sit on their laurels. They actually saw it through. Wallenberg, for example, I write about Raoul Wallenberg, who helped so many people escape from Hungary. I mean, these people showed huge courage, but it was a courage that was based on having an idea of what to do, but also willpower.
You arrived in politics as an MP of the Labour Party after initially unsuccessfully running and then winning an election at the height of the Thatcher era. Yeah. And then you shared a small office with Tony Blair in 1983. Yeah. How do you look back on those years, and what lessons do you carry forward?
I mean, the great thing for me was I was representing my home area. So I was elected to, and that's the greatest honor you can have. There's no titles that can match being elected by people who know you, or people you've grown up with, or people who you've been at school with, and they elect you as your member of parliament. And I did enjoy my time that Tony and I shared an office. It was an office without a window, and it was probably one of the smallest offices you can ever think of. But we then tried to work out how could we make a more effective contribution to reconcile, if you like, economic progress with social justice in this new environment of the 80s, 90s, where increasingly we're moving to a global economy. And we spent hours trying to work out what was the best way forward. I mean, it was an intellectual exercise, it was a political exercise, and it was a time when, you know, new ideas were coming to the surface. And we realized the problem was not that Labour or the Tories, that their values were wrong. The problem was that policies no longer reflected their values. And so we had to change the policies so that people could see that we were applying, if you like, traditional values or lasting values to new situations with, as a result, innovative policies to move us forward to the future. Now, it was, being in Parliament is I mean, it's a crazy place, let's be honest. When I started, we were voting at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was just absolutely ridiculous. And I think Harriet Harman and women who came in said that we can't have this anymore. And so the place has been changed. You know, as someone said, when you see the state of the country, do you pray for your MPs? I know the reply was, when you see the state of your MPs, you pray for the country. And I think there is some truth there in that. You know, the first 6 months you're there, you're wondering why you ever managed to get there. And then the next 6 months, you're wondering why your friends managed to get there and all the others managed to get there. So it is, you know, it's a profession, you know, for which no qualifications are thought necessary. I mean, you can't say to be an MP, you've got to be qualified in this or that. It's one of these professions where you've got to have a grounded view of what's happening to the people you're representing. And you've got to have an ability to communicate a message about the future.
What lessons do you carry forward to today, and how would you counsel social democrats or progressive parties today in how to manage their policies? Because we have to manage globalization, and that's become very difficult.
Yeah, you've got to have a vision of the future. You've got to understand what the problems people are facing as, because globalization has created losers as well as winners. And when people talk about the elephant graph of Branko Milanovic, you know, at the very top, there's been a huge increase in wealth at the expense, perhaps, of large numbers of people in the middle and lower incomes. And people now talk about the Loch Ness graph, because the Loch Ness Monster graph, because the Loch Ness Monster has a bigger head at the end. You know, that people at the very top have been moving away from the rest, and that really is not healthy for your society for the future. But you've got to found your policies on economic progress and what you can do to achieve that, and how to apply the new technologies and how you can encourage the new technologies and clusters for the new age. And it's where you can combine economic progress and social justice, I think, that you actually get through to the public most of all. So I would say to each of the political parties at the moment, you've got to rethink your ideas for a very different economy that we're about to experience as we try to build back better. But I'm not sure that the ideas are yet there to show the kind of economy and the kind of society we can have in the 2020s and later. And that's where the thinking, I think, has got to be done. And it's got to include an environmental dimension now in a way that was not really what happened in the 1980s.
Right. As Prime Minister, you successfully got ahead of events. You stepped in and dealt with the breakdown in the global banking system in 2009. You single-handedly organized and co-opted. Over the weekend that Lehman Brothers collapsed, global leaders, France, Italy, Germany, the US, heads of the EU, in order to prevent a second Great Depression. It was a triumph of global cooperation, and you were at the center of this. You coordinated a global effort.
Yeah, I actually flew to Washington to try to persuade George Bush to do this. He wasn't that keen to start with, but we managed to get him on board. But we also brought the Chinese in and the Indians. And this was the first time that in a global crisis, we brought in the whole world and not just the richest countries in the world. But, you know, it was very difficult. I went to Paris to see Nicolas Sarkozy, and Angela Merkel was there, and Berlusconi was there from Italy, and the head of the central bank, Trichet, was there, and Barroso, the head of the European Union. And this was just after Lehman collapsed. And I had an idea that the banks were undercapitalized and that we had to do something about that. But we went around the table for an hour and nobody really could come to a conclusion that everybody could agree with. And then we broke for coffee. And suddenly I heard Berlusconi shouting, "Amateurs, amateurs," he said in his French. "Ce sont amateurs," I think he said. They're amateurs. And we thought, Berlusconi, businessman, politician, he's got the solution to the crisis. We just need to listen to him. And then he said, "Amateurs," he said. "Don't all these politicians realize we have a press conference in 1 hour and none of them have brought a makeup artist with them?" And that was the seriousness with which one or two of our colleagues addressed the global financial recession. So
Well,
you've really got to work hard to get people on board. And I do think at the moment there's a great need for greater cooperation on some of the issues, both for the world economy, but also on the environment, where COP26 was not as big a success as it should have been. And also, of course, on global health and global education, where I'm trying to persuade people to come together. I mean,
well, I read, sorry to interrupt you, but going back, I read that Sarkozy at that time was saying, or at that meeting said, we don't have a plan. What are we going to do? And President Obama stood up and said, Gordon has a plan.
He was very generous, and it was his first meeting as president. And I think you said in one of the notes that this was a historic meeting because we'd never had 20 people who were leaders of the world meeting together. In fact, we called it the G20, but there were, I think, 25 there actually. And so you got them all around the table. I actually quoted Churchill, and I think you've mentioned it to me. And I said Churchill had said of a similar attempt at cooperation in the 1930s. He said that politicians, he said, were brilliantly expressed, had been resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, and all-powerful for impotence. And I quoted this back to the people just as we started this first dinner in the G20 summit, and say, we cannot allow ourselves to be blamed for failing to come together to solve these problems. So we have to be resolved and adamant and determined and get things done.
Gave them an early warning signal that that was not what you were going to be doing. So I think that was, I actually watched some coverage when you hosted this group at the dinner at a very critical time. And it was a very Churchillian moment because there's footage of you where you check the seating arrangements. And then when everyone sat down, you quoted Churchill.
Sorry, go on.
No. So, as you know, I'm very fond of Churchill, as are you. And that was just, there was this really special moment.
Yeah, and as you know, even though the financial collapse was the subject of the meeting, the leaders themselves were very concerned about a number of things. One, that they had the proper status at the meeting, so the seating arrangements had to be. But Sarkozy threatened to walk out of the meeting, and so did the Chinese. And it was a terrible thing that happened because Sarkozy said, we've also got to deal with global taxation and tax havens. And I agreed with him. I said, yes, we've got to. But he put a proposal that the Chinese, because they had this tax haven, still have, called Macau, which was a gambling den at that time. It's now been cleaned up, I think. But they said, we cannot possibly agree that this G20 talks about taxation. And they had in mind that we were going to declare that there were black and white zones for tax. And the black zones were completely unacceptable. And Macau was one of them. So the Chinese threatened to walk out. Sarkozy threatened to walk out. I asked President Obama to see if he could do something about it, but Sarkozy was still threatening to walk out. So we got to a compromise. And it's just quite amazing. We said to the Chinese, yes, we will not put this in our communique as a G20, but we phoned up the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, which are responsible for tax issues, and said, you put out a statement simultaneously. We will say in the communique, we are looking at ways of dealing with this tax problem, and you, the OECD, can, in Paris, declare what we're actually going to do about it as the OECD and not the G20. And so Sarkozy liked it because Paris was at the center of the decision. The Chinese liked it because they'd got tax detail off the agenda. But that's the sort of compromises you have to do to get things moving. And President Biden and others will be thinking of how they can actually move forward diplomatic efforts in a whole series of areas over the next few months. And you've really got to be strong and inflexible sometimes in the words you use, but you've got to be flexible in the practice so that you can get things done.
You spoke about that you achieved regulation in the banking system, but what you failed to do was really to deal with the shadow banking system.
Well, there's now arbitrage between the banking system and the shadow banking system, and the banks were trying to do too many things, and they were, if you like, operating far beyond their capacity. And certainly the leverage was too high for them to be trusted for the future. We recapitalized the banks by nationalizing two of them for a while, but got the money into the banks. And then fortunately, Europe and America then followed this. They had this TARP scheme, which was diseased assets being taken out of the banking system. We thought the whole banking system recapitalized. So we were able to get other countries to do it. But the problem now is that the regulation that governs the banking system is in contrast to the deregulated nature of the shadow banking system. Now, whether all the regulation planned after 2010 is still right is another issue. But you've really got a shadow banking system operating without the same kind of rules and supervision of the banking system. And that's led to Greensill in Britain, it's led to Wirecard in Germany, the big hedge fund collapse in the United States of America. And you will continue to see instances of that because the shadow banking system is not operating under the same rules or even procedures as I think is necessary for the amount of money. You know, most mortgages are now coming through the shadow banking system and in other areas too. And I think it's very important that we look at that, because the next crisis will probably not come out of the banks, it'll come out of the shadow banking system.
In your memoir in 2017, you contemplated the future of Afghanistan in detail. You preempted how events may potentially unravel. We do have to get on to Q&A, but there's a couple of things I just wanted to talk with you about. Was it a mistake for America to leave Afghanistan?
No, they had to go at some point, but the mistakes were made in the way that we came out. Look, I visited Afghanistan many times, and we lost 400 and more people in Afghanistan because of the war and the booby trapping of our soldiers. And I realized that you can't overnight create what is basically seen by us as an 18th century tribal society. You can't create it overnight into a modern democracy. And so this idea of nation building and state building, we've really got to think very seriously. We want these countries to flourish. We want to help them economically and socially. But we kept changing the objectives in Afghanistan. It was to help women, it was to help educate girls, it was to deal with terrorism, it was to deal with the heroin trade. And we were never clear enough about the limits of what you can achieve through nation building and state building, given the tribal nature of the society.
You know, you are advocating that, and correctly, that this is the biggest humanitarian crisis, 23 million people without food, and you've been very vocal about it. You know, had we had more time, we could have touched on this, but if we look at Afghanistan, how do you then also look back on Iraq? Very different, but...
I've been very honest, we failed, and we made mistakes. I mean, if you look at a just war, you've really got to have done everything in your power to avoid that war. And you've got to be clear about the reasons, the ethical reasons why you feel you've got to take that action. And it's clear it was based on information that I certainly didn't have, but was available to some people, that these weapons did not exist in the form that was being claimed. And I think when you look back on this, it's a sad episode, and we mustn't, our intelligence was wrong. We were relying on one or two people with vested interests. I'm talking about the Western intelligence. And we didn't take every possible action to avoid war. And that's, of course, why it's so difficult to argue the case for action when there has been so many failures of intelligence. So
if we now look at a major crisis that the world is facing with Russia right now on the Ukraine issue and the implications that has for NATO, for Europe, how would you assess the threat, and what do you advise NATO to do, or the US to do?
I had a lot of dealings with Putin, and I know him from many meetings. And the only thing he understands is strength. The first time I met him, I was in his office. He was on a high chair, and I was sitting on a couch that was deliberately, so I was looking up at him. And then he would bring out the file and say, "You are such and such and such and such." But he threatened. He said, "Look, oil and gas will either come to Europe or Asia. We don't care. If Europe doesn't meet our terms, we'll sell it all to Asia." And that was my first meeting. Then we had Litvinenko was killed in London, murdered on the streets of that. And we knew that Putin was behind it. And we knew that he was proposing to assassinate other people in our country. So we had not only to kick out the diplomats and kick out the people we thought were spies, but we had to send a message that we knew absolutely what he was doing. And we were protecting those people that he had targeted. And we did so, and the protection failed at Salisbury, obviously, a few years later. But the point I'm making is the only thing he understands is strength. Now, there are three options. One is, of course, you appease, and we must not do that. Two, that you confront and be aggressive. Now, we've learned lessons in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the policy of containment has got to be muscular. And that's where I think people are thinking, is the West sufficiently united to deliver the strength of response? And what does that containment policy involve? Now, Russia was humiliated in the 1990s, and Putin benefited from that. So the proposal for a pact on peace between East and West is still something we've got to look at. And that would bind NATO and the other countries in some sort of agreement about peace, but also about intermediate nuclear weapons and everything else. So there is a way forward that actually strengthens, if you like, those who are in favor of peace and security, rather than, as Putin seems to see it, as you either win or you lose, and it's a zero-sum game. But this will require great diplomacy over the next few days and weeks. You've got to get a settlement on the provinces in the Minsk II agreement. You've got to get a settlement on this issue of Ukraine and its membership of NATO, and you've got to get a settlement on the threat of weapons proliferating across Europe as a result of a failure of Russia and the West to be able to agree on anything.
Gordon, thank you very much. We have a lot of Q&A for you, if you would be so kind as to indulge us.
I'm delighted, and if my answers are not good enough, really come back and shout at me. Tell me they're not good enough.
Shukri, whom you've met, is as you know, a fifth-year medic.
Yep.
She's also MCR's Environment Minister. And aside from that, she's also the founder of Focus, a charity inspiring young people through sport and the spoken word.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Shukri, over to you.
Thank you, Anna. And it's both a pleasure and an honor to have you joining us here today, Mr. Brown. And thank you for such an interesting and insightful conversation. We've had questions coming in from both our YouTube and Zoom audiences, as well as our in-person audience in the Long Gallery at Queen's. So without further ado, we'll take our first question from Will in the Long Gallery.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can indeed. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. I just had a quick question about the union and regional inequality, because obviously regional inequality is something that's widened quite significantly in the last 10 years and has been suggested to be quite an important factor in both the Brexit vote and the current large Conservative majority under the premise of levelling up, quote unquote. And I was just wondering what you thought about the recently published levelling up white paper, and what, in your opinions, are the really key challenges for governments now and also in the future to be facing to really tackle this problem of regional inequality? Thank you.
Britain's got quite a unique problem, actually, because although all states have big divides within them, Britain has both a very high concentration of regional inequalities, but also we operate as a highly centralized state. And I think people are realizing that you have to devolve power downwards and create local centers of initiative, like we had in the 19th century when Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow were all major powers in the land. And I think one of the things that the Levelling Up paper doesn't really get to is the scale of the, if you like, empowerment of local mayors and others to be able to deal with some of the economic challenges they face in the future. Now, levelling up itself is an interesting word, because when you think of levelling up, you can think of leveling up one rung on the ladder. So if you go from rung 1 to rung 2, that is a form of levelling up. I prefer to think of it as equality of opportunity. I want an equality of opportunity and fairness of outcome, or if you like, equal opportunity for all and unfair privileges for no one. And I think when we're looking at the regional picture, but also at what has been spurring a lot of the anti-globalization protests, it's our failure to show people that we can have a more inclusive economy. We can have an open economy, but it's got to be inclusive as well. And I doubt if the resources are available in this Levelling Up white paper to mount the scale of the challenge that's necessary to narrow these gaps. And if you think of what happened in East Germany, when West Germany took on East Germany, it transferred 4% of its national income every year for about 20, 25 years. And that's the sort of scale of the transfer that is needed if you're going to make good some of these gaps. And you know, it's back to this enlightened self-interest. It is in the interests of the south of England that the north of England does better, and the south of the UK and the north of the UK, because what you're getting in London and the southeast is congestion, overheating, escalating house prices, inflation generated through that. And in the north, you've got the contrast, but it shows the imbalance of the economy, depopulation, forced emigration, high unemployment in certain towns, and of course the decline of manufacturing hitting them hardest. And so what you should be thinking of is something that is in the whole of the country's interest, to rebalance the economy so we don't have these terrible contrasts, which means that we all suffer from inflation or we all suffer from escalating house prices. If we could help the north, we're actually helping the south to overcome some of the problems it faces as well. So I would want to argue for a levelling up strategy that is not just about the north, it's about the whole of the country.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Zoom. Robin Walker asks, as an uninformed observer during the COVID pandemic, it seems that WHO have not been as impressive as one might have hoped. Is there something that needs to be changed in the way that WHO function?
The World Health Organization. Yeah. I think the World Health Organization knows that it needs to change, but it really is under budgeted. You know, we're asking the World Health Organization to do vaccination testing, do research, encourage coordination, build capacity in poorer countries. And its budget is less than the budget of a medium-sized hospital in America. It's about $4 billion a year. And that's just too small for it to be able to do the job of coordination and the provision of vaccines and testing and treatment. And so, yeah, we've got to think about the health architecture for the future. I come back to the fair sharing of the burden between countries to sponsor it. But yes, we've got to do better, because we were too slow to identify the epidemic. We were too slow to close borders. We were too slow to get the testing equipment, too slow to get ventilators into some countries, too slow to get basic PPE and even medical oxygen into African and other countries. And we could have done that much better. So we have got to learn lessons. I believe that Tedros is a very compassionate and actually brilliant man who's heading the WHO. But we need to think about how we can make sure that these leaders are given the resources and indeed the powers of initiative to get things done.
Thank you. Our next question is from YouTube, where Nigel asks, I'm a Brit Australian, one-time student at Queen's, now based in NYT. So I follow politics. And it seems that science, reason and logic and democracy itself is under attack. Is there hope, or are we entering a second great dark age?
I think most of us have realized the benefits of science through this pandemic. The irrational movements that we might have talked about this evening are where nationalism and populist nationalism is thriving. And that's where we've got to, I think, make a moral effort to say this is wrong. You see, I'm a patriot, I think, because I love my country. And everybody here who comes from different countries will love their country, their traditions, their history, and their culture. But I'm not a nationalist. I don't see the world in terms of a struggle between us and them. I don't actually see enemies and invent them where they don't exist, or build resentments that are imaginary and not real. And that's what's been happening. I think nationalism has become the dominant ideology of the age. It's not neoliberalism. It's not the Washington Consensus. It's nationalism, and it's countries pursuing their own self-interest at the expense of international cooperation. So I do think people have realized the benefits of science, and medicine in particular, obviously. And I do think that foreshadows a more rational world. But the political ideologies that we're dealing with are to a large extent irrational, because they're asking people to be something they're not, to simply see the other as an adversary, the outsider rather than the insider. And they create barriers, walls. You know, we've doubled the number of walls. I think there's now 65 walls have been built or have been built across Europe and the rest of the world, separating countries. And when the Berlin Wall came down, people thought that was the end of walls. People would open their borders, and now we're seeing the closing of borders, and that's the result of nationalism. And I could go through what's happening in Hungary and Poland, but also what's happening China nationalism, India, Hindu nationalism against the Muslim community, and you can go right around the world and see the power of this nationalist ideology. But it's right to be a patriot and to be proud of your country, but it's wrong to see the world just as nationalists tend to do in terms of us versus them. There's no way forward if that's the way people see the world. And we've got to persuade people by a moral effort that solidarity, reciprocity, empathy, cooperation, sharing are all important virtues that we don't really talk about enough, but yet they're so important. And I think all of us here this evening will realize that in our lives, these are important virtues, and yet the political system doesn't seem to talk about them very much.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Charlie in the long gallery.
Hi, Charlie.
Hi. So, Mr. Brown, we currently face many global challenges such as pandemics and climate change, which are made much worse by a lack of international cooperation between self-interested nations. In your view, what are the main barriers to achieving progress on global challenges? And what changes to our international institutions or in the way international agreements are negotiated or enforced would you like to see to allow more progress to be made on addressing these issues?
Yeah, well, I look back on 1945 when we came out of the Second World War, and we created the International Monetary Fund, we created the United Nations, we created the World Bank, we created the International Trade Organization, we had the Marshall Plan, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, coming out of this crisis, what can we say that we have learned and we're now about to develop? And it's because of this retreat into nation states and into forms of populist nationalism, but it's also because I think the leaders have forgotten that these are global problems that need global solutions. And they've retreated into the national silos and think that the only way that they can operate is by responding to public opinion in their own countries, but not leading public opinion to say what we talked about earlier was the enlightened self-interest of countries to show that there is a national interest in international cooperation. So yes, nationalism is on the rise, and for all sorts of reasons, cultural as well as economic, and we can discuss this, but you do need leadership. And what's not happened, I'm afraid, and Joe Biden's one of my friends, actually. I've worked with him well, and I feel that he is an internationalist who's in a sense being, his internationalism is being, if you like, held back by a more nationalist populist opinion that perhaps through Donald Trump and others, it has been created and still survives. But there are good people, and we need to find a way to persuade them to make what I call this moral effort to show that international cooperation can not only work, but you can actually fight hard as international states, men and women, to create that these new institutions that are needed. I mean, we don't have an environmental institution of any significance, even although we know that the environment is one of the three biggest problems we face, and perhaps even the biggest and most existential. But in 1945, they managed to create an economic institution, a financial institution, a trade organization, but we haven't got the environmental institution that is capable, if you like, of moving the world forward. And that's another weakness in the last 10 years of our being unable to develop the global institutions that are necessary to meet the challenges of today.
Thank you. Our next question is from Zoom, where Mary asks, Mr. Brown, what advice would you give to yourself in your early mid-20s as you began to embark on your career after graduating from university?
I think everybody's got a dream. They may not admit it to themselves or even to others, but everybody's got a dream about what their life can actually be about and be fulfilled through. And you've got to follow that dream. And I believe you've got to avoid being negative. There are many setbacks on the way, and I've had many, but you want to avoid being negative and falling for the idea that someone else is to blame. And you've got to retain this idea, which I think is the most important of all, of that there is hope for a better world. And all the great leaders that I've followed managed to communicate this idea that the future could be better than the past. And they gave people hope, and they inspired people with this idea of hope. And you know, if things are going wrong and you lose hope, you lose everything. And I do think that we've got to think about how we can communicate this idea that it is possible to create a better future. So you start with a dream, you've got to pursue it, and you've got to, you know, not lose sight of it through being diverted. But you can't afford to be negative, and you can't get into this sort of, you know, this bashing of other people. You've got to pursue the dream as if the dream is the thing you want to do. Now, everybody's got a different dream. I've talked about the environment this evening, peace. We can talk about and avoiding nuclear proliferation. We've also got the pandemic and how we have a better global health architecture. We've really got to rebuild some of our economy after the experience of this crash. All these things. So everybody's got a dream and a project, but follow it and don't leave it behind out of either skepticism or cynicism or being diverted from other things. That's the best advice I can give.
Thank you for your advice. Our next question actually comes from our college president, who asks, your decision in 1997 to grant the Bank of England independence was critical in enabling the UK to overcome a period of inflation that undermined livelihoods. This week, we're told that 5.5% inflation is at its highest level in 30 years. How should we think about what's ahead for inflation and more generally economic well-being?
I think the central banks have all got to communicate better what their trajectory is for the future. Now, I would favor, as I think my questioner does, the Federal Reserve giving up on its buying program, probably selling off some of that 9 trillion that it's accumulated. It will have to raise interest rates, but perhaps it should suggest to the world that they're not going to let unemployment or recession become something that happens because they over increase interest rates. But what you need is to communicate this message, because I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty, not just about the Fed, but about the European Central Bank and what it's going to do, because it said one day it's not going to raise interest rates, another, the impression is that it will have to raise interest rates. And I do think that, you know, central banks, as President El-Erian said a few years ago, were the only game in town. Now they should be working more closely, the fiscal and monetary authorities, because they are not the only game in town, and we need more than one instrument to deal with this crisis. So I would say communicate better, have a clear strategy, stop some of the things that really were addressed to increasing demand in the economy when the real problems are now on the supply side of the economy, and at the same time have a closer cooperation between fiscal and monetary policy, so that we can actually get ourselves out of some of these supply side problems that are hitting the economies across the world.
Shukri, another question. Do you have time for another one question?
Of course,
Okay. It's been a fascinating conversation and we've got so many questions, but in the interest of time, we'll take a final question from the long gallery, from Constantine.
You can take 2 if you like, but maybe people want to go off for the evening.
We'll take 2. Thank you very much. That's very considerate. Thank you.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Does it work? Yeah. Okay. So I have a question. About 20 years ago, there was this huge debate about whether the UK should or should not join the Eurozone. And then there's this argument that if the UK had joined the Eurozone, it would have never left the EU, sorry. If we just take that as a fact now, that's very hypothetical. Would you say that you would not have opposed a Eurozone membership if you had known that the UK would eventually leave the EU? It's very hypothetical, I know, but I'm just interested in your view on that.
It's a great question, actually. But the question I think that you maybe should ask is, could you have won a referendum to join the euro? And I think probably, look, I saw the advantages of joining the euro because you've got currency transaction, you know, cheaper transactions, you've got breaking down barriers, you've got less power to moneylenders and everything else. But I also saw the disadvantages because the British economic cycle was not in tune with the European cycle. We had a different housing market. We had a different set, financial services were a different priority to us compared with other people. And to converge would have been incredibly difficult. And I suspect we would have gone into a recession to be able to converge. And without the interest rate weapon that was then with the European Central Bank, we would have had to use fiscal policy almost on a monthly basis. So there were huge problems that I agreed made it difficult for us to join the euro at that time. But I still think that if you look at this, would you have won a referendum, which we would have had to join the euro? I think probably not. If we had joined the euro as a result of a referendum, even if people had supported it then, might we not have had to leave the European Union earlier than we did, because there would be such disaffection with the euro and with the way that, if you like, European policy was geared to lower growth rates than British policy. So I don't think that joining the euro would have made it more attractive to stay in the European Union. I think probably it would have created more problems. I still want us to be in the European Union, and I will still advocate that because I think it's important for the future. But I do think we've got to reframe the argument, and we've got to be able to talk about the positives of being in Europe, because the referendum was only about whether you're more afraid of unemployment and economic recession than you are of immigration and the sort of policies that build barriers. We have to do better than that if we're ever going to win an argument on Europe.
Thank you. And our final question comes from Alex on YouTube, who asks, what would you do to address growing UK intergenerational inequality, where young people are paying ever more to the state, but seeing less and less in return?
Well, this is the debate that's happening not just on taxation, but on social care and the contribution that we make to the elderly and the pensions costs that were involved in this triple lock. I think you need to look at this in more depth. I'm not sure that the government solution on social care was the right one. I'm not sure that we've got the housing market in a position where we can actually meet the needs. So we tend in Britain to have a very cyclical housing market. We tend to have a housing market that does never build enough houses, and therefore there's always demand exceeding supply, and therefore prices go up. These problems are going to be solved by better economic policies, but we also have to have a way. I mean, look, I'm Scottish, and I'm wanting Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland to be able to work together, and I want young and old to work together, and I want people who feel that life has not treated them well but need a better deal to be persuaded that the people who have got the resources are going to be able to help them also. So there are so many divisions within our society that, I mean, the role of government is actually to bring people together. It's to unite the country and pull people together. And to some extent, that has not happened in the way that I would have wanted during this particular crisis. People feel very distant from the government, and I think we've got to do more about it. So we're dealing with particular policy problems where you'll need new approaches, I think, for the housing market and so on. But we're also dealing with this sense that some people are treated as first-class citizens and some people are treated as second-class citizens. Some people are forgotten and ignored and trampled on and feel very left out. And to some extent, young people feel that their needs are not taken into account as we try to build for the future. You're paying high tuition fees. Housing costs have been rapidly rising. Inflation, of course, is hitting the student budget, and the jobs market is not as attractive as it was before. And many graduates are operating in a labour market where their skills are undervalued, and we've got to do something about that as well. So these are huge challenges, but you are the generation to deal with them. We made mistakes in our generation, and we could have done things a lot better. And I think I can say that we have learned from our mistakes, and I hope we will continue to do so. But your generation can solve these problems. They're great challenges. That it does need vision, but determination, and also just this sense of optimism and hope. You know, Camus. Just let me finish by saying, Albert Camus, the great French writer, met Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, André Malraux, all the great French intellectuals in 1945. And said after the collapse of France during the war, he said to them, didn't we get it all wrong when we supported our existentialist ideas? should we not have admitted that there was such a thing as moral values? And then he said, and that would be the beginning of hope. And I do think we need a debate about ethics as well as about economics in our society. And I do believe if we were debating that, then people who wanted to share, cooperate, show empathy, and yes, be competitive and sometimes be apetitive, but you will see that these moral virtues that we don't talk about will come to the fore. And I think Camus, the great existentialist alongside Sartre, was admitting he'd got it wrong by not focusing on moral issues. And he said, and I just end with that this would be the beginning of hope. Tennyson wrote these great poetry in the 19th century. And at the end of his life, he wrote this poem called Locksley Hall 40 Years On, which was so pessimistic about the world. And it said, "O cosmos chaos, O chaos cosmos, when will it ever end?" And Gladstone, who was the prime minister at that time, said, "This is ridiculous, Tennyson. Look at the social progress that we've made despite all the difficulties. Go back to your original poem, Locksley Hall, before Locksley Hall 40 Years On." And what did Tennyson say? "Dipped into the world as far as I could see and saw the vision of the future and the world that could be." And that's, I think, this idea that things can be better, that we can build out of hope and optimism, and we can actually work together to create a better world. And I would not like to finish without sort of emphasizing that all the lessons I've learned in politics is that you've got to have this dream about the future. You've got to have this vision that you can actually do something. And perhaps I fell down quite a lot on that. And it's not just about practical day-to-day issues. It's about showing people that you can create a better world.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, it was truly a pleasure having you here with us today. And as expected, we couldn't get through the vast number of questions we received. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question. I know that I personally learned a lot from this evening, and I know our audience has too. Anna, I'll hand back over to you now.
And best of luck with your charity and also with your medical studies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shukri, and thank you to all for your very thoughtful questions. I would like to thank everyone participating this evening. And Gordon, I would like to thank you for the privilege of this conversation, for being a guiding light, a steady and safe pair of hands that the world can look to when it seems many leaders are adrift. We look forward to welcoming you and Sarah to Queen's in the near future.
We'd love to come, and thank you for your chairmanship and for bringing together so many people this evening. It's been a pleasure for me and a privilege to be able to join this, and I wish all in the college all the best successes in the future. I know that this college is going places and will do very well in the next few years.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone. Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.